Well, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for the folks who are logging in a little bit early because it really does make it easy for us to get good use out of the time. And as per usual, we have a ton of stuff to do today. So I wanted to start off, however, by saying, well, this is class number 10. And I wanted to give a huge thank you to the Vineyard Haven Public Library and to Anne, our fearless co-host, who has done so much to help make sure that these classes are working so well. It's really quite incredible to be able to log on every week, to know that she has my back, that she remembers to tell me to unmute myself so I don't start talking and giving a whole class that you can't actually hear. So they do wonderful events and still a lot of online programming that you can attend during the week if you're not living here on Martha's Vineyard. So go to the Vineyard Haven Public Library website and have a look at their events and see what you can sign up for, because they're amazing things all year long. And I'll let their schedules speak for themselves. And I also wanted to thank in advance our model for today. Adriana is a friend and a fellow artist on the island, and I will include her website information and such in the PDF that we send around. But she came over to my studio and sat for 20 minutes solidly so that I could video her, and we're going to draw from her probably using that same video twice today, if we're lucky, because I'd like to have a long drawing session and take you through the sort of the second half of the Trois Couleurs method. So that being said, let me go ahead and start to share the screen and share with you some material we have. Okay, so welcome back once again to Summer of Drawing. And oh, look at that. I put class number 1 instead of class number 10. Well, there's something for me to correct for the video. But this is definitely class number 10. And thank you so much to everyone for having stuck with it through all of these different drawing media. We've covered a lot of subject matter and also a lot of different methods for actually drawing. And I'm hoping that you're starting to see that everything can really be mixed together, and the techniques and the concepts really work across the board. There aren't too many that are very specific to the medium, but we will be talking about a few things about Conté Crayon itself, which really are specific and are sort of things to watch out for as we're drawing today. So just a very quick review for those of you who weren't here for the class last week. Conté Crayon is this combination of compressed powdered graphite in a clay base. And so that it does make it kind of a hard material. And as I was discussing with someone just before the class started, the different types, the different forms, I've got a pencil here, and I've got a stick of the Conté Crayon in the compressed form here. And also other pastels put out by Conté and different brands of Conté Crayon. For example, I think Generals does a compressed Conté now. Every single one of those has different properties. Some feel a little bit more waxy than others. Some are a little more crumbly. And so depending on the type of Conté Crayon and the brand you're using, your results may vary. And you might find some are easier to blend one way and some are more difficult. You might find that, for example, as I did, when you use the little sticks of Conté, you can get some finer lines because it is a harder substance. You can use sandpaper or a little penknife to whittle down the end. At the same time, it's a little harder to hold the sticks of Conté than it might be in pencil form. The pencil form is slightly more crumbly. So as you apply that to paper, it'll make a bit more of a mess, but that makes it also easier to smooth out. I did find across the board when I was experimenting this week myself, that Conté Crayon is not as easy to pick up off the paper as charcoal. So it's very, very easy to go too far with Conté Crayon. And so today, as we're drawing, you might find yourself with something a lot darker and with a lot more color than you'd intended. And that's why we're going to spend, I'm hoping, about 35 or 40 minutes drawing from Adriana and trying to get that 3-color mix going, because you might decide to abandon a drawing as you're into it and what you want to start again. And if that's the case, please do. Rather than just fighting against a drawing that isn't working, it's better to go, hey, let me try starting again, because it's successful starts that will get you where you want. Okay, so toned paper is what most people may be trying to work on today, and it's definitely what's recommended for Trois Couleurs, with a medium range of value. And after we stop, I've got a couple of images to show you other drawings I did that are just using similar methods on colors you might not expect, just to show you how it can work. And I'm going to show you a few more pieces of artwork just to get you back in the mood, or for people who weren't here last week. And we have just a series here of different images that have different sort of quantities of that, looking for the red tinges. So with Conté Crayon in general, or with using white and black charcoal on a toned canvas, you can of course just use the two colors, white, black, and whatever the colored paper is. Sorry, not canvas, but paper. And that gives you a nice blend. The third color, the Trois Couleurs, is adding in a reddish or a sanguine or a sepia or some other tone, just to bring out those things that those blood vessels, those things that bring a drawing to life. Now, just to quickly go over some of the different options that are available when you work on toned paper, I have some examples here using both 2 and 3 colors that I think you'll find interesting. So we talked a little bit last week about people with different skin complexions, how a lot of the 3-color method that you see or actually, white people with reddish tinges to their face. And that is because a lot of the artwork that was done, Peter Paul Rubens, Antoine Watteau, they were working in places where that was the main complexion that you saw of the people around them. But that doesn't at all eliminate being able to use these kinds of methods to draw anyone at all. So this is a beautiful example by Scott Burdick in just 2 colors, black and white chalk or charcoal on a toned paper, just really nicely done. And you can see that all you're doing really is you're paying careful attention to the value of different areas of a face or a body, just as you would if it was a white person in shadow, or a very dark-skinned person, very well lit. It really doesn't matter. There isn't a particular rule for one kind of skin color or another. You just have to really observe what's going on and how you can use the materials you're drawing with to adapt to that particular person's face. So here's a gorgeous example by Michael DeVore. And once again, less sketchy than what we just saw by Scott Burdick. Beautifully folded cloth up there, and really gorgeous attention to the face. And then I just love the way the rest of the drawing sort of tapers off a little bit. So now adding in that third color. This is a sketch that is done in charcoal with also some white charcoal highlights, but also introducing that sanguine or that reddish colored chalk. And Sarah Golish, this is a 2-color, I'm pretty sure it's just 2 colors, using a nice dark toned paper. Beautifully defined values on the skin. A lot of observing how those values work and where the reflected lights are to give you a sense of form. And I don't know who this person was, but I thought it was just really wonderful. This is bringing in now that third color, that reddish tone, looking for how the reddish tone can combine with another color. And in this case, I think the third color is not black, but it's a darkish brown. So you've got the dark brown, the white, and the reddish color on a toned paper. So there are, you can really play around with this. And Sarah Golish shows us that again, because in this particular case, her third color is this blue. And wow, doesn't that work nicely? So that paper color that she's working on is sort of it's a grayed down reddish color. That's not really very specific, but if you see the paper, you'll see what I'm talking about. And it turns out to be just perfect for this particular face. And Dan Thompson has done one of these, I mentioned this last week, the sort of the style of drawing where only red chalk is used, or red chalk with a little bit of white chalk or white charcoal. And this is a gorgeous example of that. So once again, ethnicity and complexion really are not a factor. They're not, this is not, the three color method is not just for drawing certain people. Likewise, red chalk, you can draw anybody in the red chalk. It's a matter of looking at where the darks and the lights are on that person, how that person is lit, and then interpreting that using the colored paper, the toned paper, as your mid color. So you've got the highlights are just in the white, the mid color is the toned paper, and then for the darks, you use whatever other colors you have on hand. I love this example by Dan Thompson. And then we have this gorgeous example by Wu, who has used, I think, a couple of colors in there. It's Conté Crayon, but I think probably there's probably a kind of an ochre color and a red, and then uh, a black, or it could be a brown, a red, and a black. I'm not quite sure. And then a tiny little bit of white. So, in other words, a very limited palette using that color of the toned paper as the mid color for everything. And isn't that beautiful? I mean, what an expression. And lastly, I wanted to show you another one of these red chalk examples. So this is John William Waterhouse, and a beautifully done sketch preparation for a painting. Also, just note how the lines, form around the body, around the fabric. There's a sense of action and motion going on. Just really beautiful. So lots of options. Now, this is so Adriana Eftimie is who we're going to be drawing today. She's an artist who is on the Vineyard. You'll have to check out her website, and I'll include it in our PDF that we send around. So I took this still because I wanted to talk about this a little bit before we got started. So she came over and sat in my studio, and I just put a video recorder on her and recorded her for about 20 minutes. And I think we're going to be able to play the whole video twice, which will give you a nice long time to really try this. So I didn't light her as I would for a painting, in which case I would probably have added another light over on our right-hand side, just a really subtle light to give a little bit more form to her hair. Because what I wanted to do instead was have this really strong directional lighting coming in from our left that allowed so many of these edges to get lost. And you know how we were speaking a few weeks ago about not drawing what you can't see. So if I could see your paper this week, which I can't, and which I'm not going to ask to see, what I would not want to see is any hair lines being drawn over there on our right-hand side where the back of the chair and the hair meet, because you can't see any lines of hair. Once you get past the background white that you can see kind of going through some of the strands of hair, you can't see what's back there. Likewise, you really can't see where the shoulder, the hair, and the back of the chair all come together. So those are those lost edges I mentioned looking for. And by including those in your drawing and making sure forms just sort of meld together like that, you can create much more of a sense of realism. And you see that also very clearly around her neck, where the hair is falling in such a way to create a shadow across her neck. And that is a lost edge. There is no line back in there that you can see defining one place from another. So if you find yourself drawing those lines, just stop, because what you want is a mass, a dark mass, a large value back there. And likewise, although you might not get to these kinds of details when we're drawing, but if you're drawing her eye that we see on the right-hand side, and you see that the dark of where her upper eyelid and the eyelashes are, and the top of the iris and pupil, if you're starting to make like what I call those Egyptian eyes, where you can see all the way around, stop right there, and let those darks blend into the dark of her hair. Because if we squint at this, and just take a moment and just squint right now, squint and look at this, there's really a large continuous dark shape that starts, actually it goes all the way around from her top to the back of the chair, up her hair, and then down the shaded side behind where the light is hitting on her hair. So as you start drawing, if you're drawing in just pencil, start putting in those areas that you see, sort of try to draw the person's face, draw Adriana's face, but then before you start trying to draw in lines that indicate here's the nose and here's the mouth, shade in those large dark areas because those will help create the form. Like I said, Adriana just sat. I played the video camera and I made the mistake up front of chatting to her to begin with. And I was playing a book on tape. And so you'll see her sort of reacting to things I'm saying until finally I realized the way that this is going to work is for me to leave the room and not disturb her during this time. But a person who, if you've never drawn from life before, I wanted to talk about it, just a couple of things before I start playing this. One is, if you ever go to a live drawing session and you're there with other people and there's a model, often if it's life drawing, there'll be warm-up poses that you do, and they'll do like 5-minute poses and then a 10 and then a 20 and then a 30 or something like that. And it means you do a lot of warm-up stuff, but it also means it's difficult if you're trying to you just draw ahead to get to a more final drawing. So people have started doing, especially online, they're offering models who will sit specifically for portraiture. And that tends to be the upper body. And the person is trying to sit for a good amount of time, 20 minutes, a half hour, or 40 minutes with breaks. So given all of that, what is very useful for you to do is in the first 20 minutes, so the first time I play this video through, concentrate on getting the proportions right. Because if you've got those general proportions that you have done lightly, whether in the red or red and black and maybe just with a little bit of white, then when we go through this the second time, even if she's moving a little bit, you'll be ready to draw and get in the shading and such that you want. But if you don't have the proportions in the right place, you'll be fighting this as you go. So that's just a little bit of a hint. Also, if you can spend a couple of minutes before you start drawing, just looking at her as we are right now, very closely and figuring out where are you going to start. And I would suggest that good places to start your drawing are where you see areas of high contrast. So just as we've drawn everything else so far during this series of classes, the edge of what we see is the left-hand side of her face, and then where the hair comes over. Those are, and then the top of her hair where you see it against the background, those are really great places to start drawing in some major lines. So what I'm going to do is I had initially thought I would do a little demonstration to go along with this, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. I would like you to just draw your own way, try a number of different methods. Don't be afraid to start from the beginning again, and try a different stroke. Adriana is, oops, there we go. All right, so Adriana is sitting here. I'm chatting to her, so you're going to see her react a little bit right here and talk to me. But after a few minutes, she'll be sitting really still. But in the meantime, her face is basically in the same place, so you'll be able to get started on figuring out sort of what the proportions and such are. So what we're talking about, and this is just something good to know if you're ever in a position of having someone sit to you, is I'm trying to find a position, a place for her to actually look at over on a far wall so that she can sort of keep going there. What happens is for a model, you end up drifting, your attention drifts away. And so it can be very difficult. As you get more relaxed, you get sleepy, things are distracting. And so what I did was I just put a Post-it note up on a far wall. And this is just something that you can do if you ever have somebody sit for you who is not used to being a professional model. It's just sort of, it's sort of helpful to do that kind of thing. And I'd like to just, as you're sketching along, like I said, we'll play this. This is about 18 minutes long. So you've got a little bit of time here to start drawing and start getting into your drawing. But I wanted to just sort of talk in the background about a few things that may be of interest or might be useful to you. One is the paper that I often draw on called canson paper. And it's available in many different colors. And I showed you earlier sort of some arrays of the colors. And I did want to point out that paper has both a smooth and a rough side to it. And if you have not used canson paper before, or if you find yourself getting uneven results, you might double check which side of the paper you're using. What I find, I tend to like the smoother side because I like to draw some of these faces or objects smaller on smaller pieces of canson paper that I'll then end up putting into a sketchbook. But if you are drawing larger and you like the rougher look of, for example, a charcoal type of drawing, then the rougher side of the canson paper is really nice because it picks up the powdery aspect of either Conté or charcoal or any of the rough materials that you're working with. So I just wanted to mention that. Also, I did find that the pencil format for the Conté Crayon, which is not the same as the Conté Pastel. The Conté Pastel is a little more crumbly, and it seems that using either sandpaper or using a penknife to sharpen that is the best way. But if you're using the pencil form of the Conté Crayon itself, which is a little bit softer than the long blocks, you can put that in the electric pencil sharpener to sharpen it. And I know that because I experimented this morning and I was able to do that without having the tip crumble. So those are just a couple of little hints to keep in mind. Now, as you're drawing somebody like this who you're drawing from life, and you feel that sort of that pressure of the time commitment, I would strongly suggest, if you possibly can, just relax a little bit. You know, for example, this video is going to be up online. You know that I'll be sending around a still of Adriana as part of the PDF, so you'll be able to continue to draw from it. But it is useful to get that feeling of urgency that comes over you when you do have to draw someone, because even having a person sit for 20 minutes is a long time. It's very, Adriana did an excellent job, but it is extremely difficult to have somebody, particularly someone who isn't a really willing subject, sit there for that long. So this whole idea of spending the first moments getting the general shape of the face and marking out where the large areas of contrast are, just sort of like the no-tan drawing we've done from the beginning, that is the most useful thing you can possibly do to start off with, rather than getting right in there to the details of the eyes and nose and this, that, and the other. Because once again, if you squint and look at Adriana right now, you'll notice that there is not a line that defines the left-hand side of her nose. It's white. So at the time that you want to show where her nose is, you'll be using, if you're using the Trois Couleurs on colored paper, you'll be using the white charcoal or the white Conté to show that line. If you're drawing in pencil on white paper, you won't be putting anything down at all to show that. And so you have to be very careful about how those shadows of the nose come up towards the ridge to make sure that her nose is in the right place. So that's really detailed stuff to start with. And what's better to do initially is to simply mark out very lightly the shapes of shadow that you see and the forms that are across the face or of the hair, the back of the chair, maybe the neckline, just those large shadow shapes in generally the place they're supposed to be. So this brings me back again to mentioning or reminding everyone to check your angles and to use your pencil by holding your pencil up to the screen, checking the angle that you see. You might have to close one eye, and then very carefully, without moving the angle of the pencil, bring it back over to your page and check and see how you drew that angle. Often our first take that we do without looking too carefully is often a little bit off. And if you make lots and lots of angles on a person's face that are all a little bit off, you'll end up with somebody who doesn't look like the person that you're looking at. So initially, of course, we just draw a few lines out there and we try to get them as close as we can. But before you move into a stage of doing anything more detailed, you really want to double check your lines. So I'll give you a few minutes here to keep doing that. I've got some other notes to tell you about, but I'll be quiet for a few minutes. Okay, now if you're at a point where you're already thinking of moving into a bit more detail with the reddish tones for the Trois Couleurs, for figuring out where those red tones are, I would sit and take a moment before you start just sort of drawing and look at her skin, look at and notice where those reddish tones are and how dark and light they are. And one thing that you'll see on the side of her face, which is on our right, is that there are reddish tones there that are extremely light, very, very light. So you may not want to put in all of that color right away. Where you can start, obviously, is that deep, dark reddish color that's in the corner of her eye on what we see as the left-hand side, under her nose, her mouth, and you've got some really good reflected lights under her chin, and then reflected from her hair on what we see as the left-hand side. So those are good places to start where you see stronger color. Now, what to do about her hair, which has very strong reddish color, but that might not be the actual color of your pencil. And so this is where we get into a problem or with our own brains, basically. When we see a color that is red and is reddish, but isn't the color that we're actually using, what we have to do is remember, how would we draw this if we were using only two colors, only black and white? If we were sketching this, for example, on white paper, or if we were doing it on toned paper, but we were only doing black and white. In that case, we would have to sort of interpret what's going on in the hair. And for example, say we were drawing in two colors, we might draw the white that goes up to the edge of the hair. We might sketch that around her head and leave the reddish tone of her hair as the paper color, regardless of what color that paper was. Because what we would be trying to do is just a symbolic version of Adriana using only two colors. If we were using only black on white, it would be the same problem. We might decide to do some light shading, because obviously her hair is darker than the background, but of course we wouldn't have red. So it's sort of up to you how you want to handle a specific local color that really is a reddish tone. I would definitely say for the Trois Couleurs, of course, you're going to put the reddish tones in her face and her lips and this, that, and the other. And because you are going to put some color where a similar shade is in her mouth, then it makes sense to also lightly indicate reddish tones in the hair as well. And to not worry about, hey, it doesn't match, quote unquote, but say that, reddish tones I'm going to indicate with the sanguine or the terracotta or whatever kind of red you're using. It doesn't have to be this particular shade. It can just be reddish in general. So this is where, when I mentioned the apple last week, and we think of red apples and how the heck would we go ahead and do that in Trois Couleurs? And it's actually easier to do things that are tinged in a color than it is to do items that are a particular color, because our minds want to suddenly start matching. And we're trying to figure out, how do we mix black and the brown color we have to make the red? Well, of course, we can't do that. So we're doing a representation. And what you end up with on the page is not a realistic rendering of skin tones like a painting, or realistic rendering of hair like a painting, but is a version, an impression of what we're seeing using a very limited palette of colors. And at this point, you're probably pretty well into laying out your drawing, and you may have already started adding some whites if you're using the Trois Couleurs method, or you might be actually, if you're not using the Trois Couleurs method in your drawing, you might be at a point where it would be good to pick out some highlights with your eraser. So this is a really important stage of any blending method. And anytime you're using Trois Couleurs or charcoal or pencil, where you're blending rather than or smudging your graphite or whatever it is, rather than using hatching. At some point, you're going to want to stop and clean up some of the areas that have got too dark. And so whether you're using a kneaded rubber eraser or some other kind of eraser, I recommend against using the ones at the end of the pencil because they have a tendency to smear the graphite around and can kind of mess things up. But you'll want to take, if you have a kneaded rubber eraser, kind of shape the end of it and pick out those highlights on her nose, on her forehead, underneath her eye, on what we see as the left-hand side, and on her chin. And also on her collarbone as it runs across into the light. Because as you draw, just the same way as happens when you paint, what goes on is that you sort of find and lose your subject over and over again. And I've heard that, when I heard that term initially, I didn't really understand what it meant. But what it implies is that there isn't a direct path from those initial lines you put on the page to the end product. It's not as if you just sort of march along on your path to the finished drawing and everything just goes where it's supposed to. Would that it did. But what happens in real life is that we put some stuff down, we smudge. Okay, that looks good for the tone, but I just got the color in the eye where it wasn't supposed to be. Or, I did some really great blending over on the left-hand side, but now you can't see that nice clean delineation of the side of her face. So artists call this business of using the eraser during the course of your drawing as picking out the highlights or finding the edges again. Those are terms that are used a lot. And it's why I'm so keen that you don't feel uncomfortable about using your eraser as much as possible. Erasers were made for a reason to get that graphite and charcoal and such and Conté Crayon up off the paper. Now, when pigment is added to the charcoal or it's added to the Conté Crayon, it makes it a lot harder to lift it up off the paper. You'll find that even on a softish paper like the Canson, it can be difficult to remove color. And so this is why we're going to basically play this video of Adriana twice. Because when we come to the end of this first go through, I want you to evaluate your work and say, okay, should I continue with this particular piece I'm working on? Or have I learned a bunch of things? And I'm imagining, especially if this is your first time using Conté, or perhaps your first time drawing from someone who's sitting in front of you like this, you might be like, I have learned a lot of things and I probably would like to start again. So as I mentioned a couple of classes ago, I think, it's great to have lots of starts. You don't worry if your sketchbook is filled with starts and not with lots and lots of finished drawings. It's more important that you get these first steps under control, because successful first steps will then take you to, successful middle and final stages. But if you haven't got the first bits right, it's going to be very, very difficult to fix and make changes later on. So it's better, even if today you do 3 or 4 different starts, each one will get a little bit better and a little bit closer. It's important to be able to critique and look at your own work and sort of see where to go next. Oh, I just realized I had muted myself. I was chatting away about art criticism, and That's not helpful if you can't hear me. So we have just a few minutes left on this particular part of the pose. And I was chatting a little bit about art criticism and being able to critique your own work. We have given a sort of a profession of people the right to be called an art critic. And we tend to say, well, also, you know, teachers and professional artists can also be critics. But an individual often doesn't know where to go next with their own work. And I think that what's very useful is developing, to the extent you can, the ability to stand back and look at your artwork in comparison to what it is that you're drawing and deciding what is working and what is not working about your drawing. We have a tendency to focus very heavily on what is not working rather than what is working. So that's another reason why having a lot of starts is important, because in those starts, you will see things that you got right, things that were in the right place. You can duplicate that in your next start. What is more difficult, I think, is when you've put 10 hours into a drawing to be able to then go, hey, you know what? Maybe that nose wasn't in the right place after all. That is a lot more difficult of a decision to make. Okay, we're at the end of this particular iteration of the video. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, although that's dangerous, and give everybody just a break, take a breather, look at your work, see what you're doing. And I wanted to, we're going to start this whole process again, because we've got about another 15 minutes. We're going to play this again. But I wanted to show you, there's a book called Keys to Drawing, which is an inexpensive and really wonderful drawing book. Bert Dodson, I wrote this book maybe 50 years ago, I think, or 30 years ago, not that long ago. And it has some really good advice in it. And I'm going to read some sections from it as you're drawing again, because it's really decent. It's interesting. He takes a little bit of a different tack from me on a number of things that he introduces, but I do think it's really useful to see what other artists have to say about drawing and about approaching drawing. So I'm doing a second little video, which I'm recording this afternoon, where I have 6 books that are ones that I sort of recommend. I did a video a little while ago on this, and I'm going to do it again. And Keys to Drawing is one of those books that I definitely recommend adding into your library. So I'll send, that video will be uploaded tomorrow as well to my YouTube, along with the class one. But for the moment, I'll give you a little bit of a preview. Okay, so we're ready to draw Adriana again. You know, take a breath, start again if you need to. Let's go. Let me see, let me make sure I can get this right technically again. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if we're starting from the beginning again, so you're going to see her changing her expression again as well, which is always a little unsettling. Now, what happens when you're drawing somebody who's live and who's doing, say, 40 minutes, and they are often, someone is given a break every 15 minutes or so. And when they sit, poor Adriana, I didn't give her a break every 15 minutes. She had to sit there for the 20. But during the course of that time, when they do come back from their break, almost inevitably, they're going to sit in a slightly different position, or their head or their nose will be slightly different. And so what happens is when you come back the second time and a person is even fractionally out of, you know, or perhaps they're a little more tired, so their chin is lower, or they're trying hard, but they're not exactly in the same spot. This is when you're really relying on those lines that you drew initially. You're really relying on being able to now just look at shading, you know, now just look at the general overall shape of the person and the values and getting the shading right. Because if you start drawing what the new pose is, basically after that person has resettled, all of a sudden, you know, now the nose doesn't go with the mouth and with the eyes and this, that, and the other. So this is something that takes a long time to develop. Your ability to be able to get enough information down in that first 20 minutes to be able to carry yourself, say, for an hour of painting or drawing. And sometimes it's even longer than that. But this skill is really useful. And even if you aren't able to do it this particular time, and of course, Adriana was a perfect model and sat exactly where we wanted her to sit for the entire time. It's something to keep in mind for when you are trying to sketch, you know, a friend or a family member, a spouse who perhaps only has a limited amount of attention and ability to sit still, is getting those initial lines down. All right, and I'm going to find my glasses, and when I do, I can then read to you a little from this drawing book. 1 second here. Now, I know some of you who've been at the classes all summer or listening to the videos all summer will be thinking, oh, she picked this because this fellow says the same things that she does. So I have to say, yeah, I did pick a few of his bits of advice that I thought were particularly pertinent. So one of the first things he does in this book is he has a number of sort of overall drawing rules that he uses. And this one in particular, I thought was particularly good, which is to tie the shapes together. So that's what we're doing today. This is just by aside. What we're doing when we talk about lost edges is we're tying shapes together. So this is what he says. Tying shapes together is a unifier, bringing the parts together to create a cohesive whole. The drawing of cows that he did that had black and white cows sort of interlocked shapes together. It clearly illustrates this. By running together the black shapes of their markings, that is, leaving no boundary lines between one cow and another, the artist creates a unified pattern. This is a wonderful design device. We see separate individual cows, and yet at the same time, we see a continuous, uninterrupted black shape running through the herd. This is an example of what I call a straddle, embracing opposite qualities simultaneously. And then another type of shape merging is when you have people who are sitting close to each other. For example, two women whose dresses are a similar color, and the forms actually merge in certain places. We can't see one from the other. Sometimes merging the shapes in only one or two places is sufficient. So you can tie shapes together when any two adjoining shapes are the same tones, or almost the same. We often merge the dark shapes, but white or middle toned shapes may be merged just as effectively. So I thought that was also a good point. We don't really have much of an illustration of this today, except if you look in the background over on the far right, the second fold in from the right, you can see how the sort of a merging that goes on right there, so that you wouldn't necessarily draw a line of a fold in the background heading all the way up. But I thought that was a really key point about merging light areas as well as dark ones. And here's a observation from Bert Dodson that I think is particularly applicable at about this point in the class. He calls it observation and fatigue. By now you have probably discovered that intense observation is hard work. Remember, we didn't promise it would be easy. Fatigue is inevitable. It often comes on before you realize it. There are, however, several signs you can learn to recognize. One of this is a sudden awareness of time. Ordinarily, involvement in a drawing is like involvement in a dream. You are seldom aware of the passage of time. But once you become time conscious, you are probably getting tired. Other indications include an awareness of distractions and a tendency to digress into drawing from knowledge rather than from observation. At this times, it's best to simply stop drawing. The best strategy for outwitting fatigue is to develop the technique of focusing. This is done by capturing the most interesting parts of your subject before fatigue sets in. Select ahead of time certain areas of interest in your subject and concentrate on developing those areas first at the expense of others, which are only briefly considered. Focusing allows you to bunch up both your energies and your time to be spent in just a few areas. For example, in a figure, the interest areas might be the head and hands. The rest of the drawing is treated with utmost simplicity. And here's here's another observation from Bert on self-critique. So crucial to you becoming an artist is the ability to evaluate your own work. This doesn't mean taking a self-critical attitude, and it doesn't mean rendering a good or bad verdict on a particular drawing. Inevitably, there will be strengths and weaknesses in your work. You'll want to learn to spot these with an objective and detached attitude. The time to do this is after you've made the drawing, but if possible, when the scene is still before you, on the model or in the pose. So Bert Dodson is basically saying the same sort of thing on self-critique that I am, that although I like you to start a lot earlier and not wait till the end of the drawing. But I think it is really important to, at some point, be able to remove yourself from your artwork and look at it objectively, to divide it back down into parts. Go, did the proportions work? Maybe the proportions aren't so great, but my lost edges are really good. Or maybe my proportions are great, but I didn't get those lost edges at all. And I did exactly what Elizabeth told me not to do, which is draw the hair over there by the back of the chair. So these are the sorts of things when it comes to self-critique that I think that you can develop. I'm not at all keen, as I've told you before, on me passing judgment on your work as good or bad. Although I can often look at a person's work and say, okay, then that's great. The next thing to work on is this. And so I'm always happy to see your work and for you to email it to me and this, that, and the other. But don't feel that you're under any obligation to do that sort of thing. I think it's really important to feel comfortable working on your own work without any other person passing judgment on it. Sooner or later, you'll get to a drawing where you're like, hey, that really worked, and I want to show somebody. I'm really proud of the way that turned out. But there are going to be lots of attempts, and gosh knows I make them myself, where I'm halfway through it and I'm like, you know what? I'm just ripping this page up. It is just rotten. I'm even taking it out of my sketchbook, which is something I rarely do. But sometimes you just hit that wall and you're like, okay, I know where I took the wrong turning. I know how to get back on the road. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to work on this drawing again. Okay, so let's just wrap up about another minute on Adriana, and then I've got a couple of final notes for you. So I wanted to also show you, I had used the sort of the 3-color method for this sketch. It's for a little painting I want to do at some point. And in one of the earlier classes, I think I showed you the pieces of shattered pottery that I was taking pictures of, trying to figure out, how the shadows lay, what kind of layout I would like. And it turns out it was terracotta pottery. And so it was very easy for me to add that third reddish tinge in there. And so I thought it was really, kind of fun to do this. And I spend most of my time working using just 2 colors. I like the toned paper. I like the dark of a pencil or charcoal or whatever, and I like the white highlight. So, what this told me was, hey, Elizabeth, you like that 3-color method so much, you need to practice it. And this is what I want you to do, and this is what I'm going to do as well. We're covering a lot of different drawing media during the summer, and as I mentioned, I don't draw in all of these media all the time, but I love them all. And so how am I going to get better? I'm going to get better by practicing. It's very much as if I decided to go and jump in the pool after, not swimming for 20 years. And I can remember the strokes, but there are a lot of things that aren't quite there. The muscle isn't quite there. I haven't quite got my timing on the breathing down. The pool seems a lot longer than the last time I went in it. So it's like that for drawing. Don't expect miracles the first time through. Rip up those early ones if you don't like them, or keep them around just so you can see your progress. But the point is to keep at it. I'm obviously much more practiced at doing the 2-color method because I do it all the time and I really like it. So now my challenge to myself is to start working in that 3rd color and really refine how much color I use and when I use it. So I hope that my travails will encourage you to continue also when you hit a few stumbling blocks, as we all do when we're pursuing art. We tend to look at beautiful works by past masters and think that everything that came off of their pencil was gorgeous. But if you look through, for example, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, not everything he drew was great. Um, and I'm not trying to, to bash Leonardo in any way. But what I mean is that you know, the requirement, each artist doesn't require themselves that degree of greatness. They require of themselves the ability to explore and to practice and to try new things. That's what being an artist is about. Two things happen. One is that over time, the better drawings are saved and the less ones sort of disappear. And we have a tendency to think every artist from, hundreds of years ago did everything beautifully because those are the pieces that remain to us. The other thing that happens is an artist gets rediscovered, after some period of time, 100 years or whatever, and all of a sudden, the gallerists and the critics and the museum people want to imbue everything they did with some sort of, flash of genius, which is a disservice to the artist in another way. So, I mean, you can have works by an artist that are better and works by an artist that aren't so good. And it's important to be able to recognize their progress and how they worked on, their own practice to get to those pieces that really are wonderful. And to look at your own work the same way, not to judge it, not to say, well, hey, do I have that, spark of genius? And if I don't, I should just give up. Absolutely not. And this is why I want you to develop your own eye. When you look at the artwork of other artists, of past masters, to be able to discern which was their better work and which was the work where they were just sort of playing around or trying to figure out how something worked, or maybe it was just a quick sketch. And just let it be whatever it was. You as an artist know when you look at their work, what they were up to. You don't need someone to interpret that for you, a gallerist or a museum director or an art critic. You're an artist. You can look at what another artist produces and understand what was going on. Okay, enough of that. So lastly, just to wrap up, Trois Crayons method of skin tones can be done using any colored drawing material, media on toned paper. Um, with the caveat that I found out that some really are more suited than others, perhaps to your own drawing style. So practice. Um, Look for those tinges of color within the subject, and less is definitely more. Particularly, I will say from my own experience, those white highlights. I think keeping them, fewer is usually the best deal. And also only enough dark shading to suggest the shadows in the form, and let that paper be the midtone. So if you're drawing a person who is darker, of course there'll be more darker values, but at the same time, don't cover up all that colored paper. You definitely want the colored paper to play its part. The reddish or sanguine color goes exactly and only where you see that color occur. If you go about it from that point of view, you'll be able to keep things under control. But it is a helpful step, I think, to start off doing those initial lines of the face while you're just sort of figuring out where everything is going, using that red color. It is a little easier to control how many darks go down if you're not starting with black all over the place. So the Trois Couleurs or Trois Crayons method works because it emulates what we see when the blood vessels are closest to the skin. It breathes life into black and white paintings. So to make that work, spend some time observing people, their hands, their feet, their knees, elbows, ears, noses, mouths, around the eyes, the places where we see those blood vessels near the surface. And then you'll know kind of where to look when you start drawing them using this method. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Trois Couleurs, definitely something to try. And you can expand your idea of what those three colors are to suit your purposes. I look forward to talking to you next week when we talk about Silver Point.